Hi guys, tonight, we're not starting with a thinker, a poet, or some dusty chapter from history. We re-beginning with a storm of iron wills, a crew of half-frozen wanderers who looked at the North Atlantic and said, "Yeah, that's just a morning stroll, the Vikings." But before we drift into that world together, take a quiet moment. If what I do helps you relax, learn, or just unwind, then tap the like button and subscribe only if it truly feels right. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it over there? Because every night, this little community lights up from every corner of the world, and it's a beautiful thing to witness. So settle in, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and let's sink slowly, gently, into tonight's journey. The first thing every Viking learned about sailing wasn't courage, navigation, or how to swing an axe. It was cold, not ordinary cold, but the kind that felt alive, the kind that crawled under your skin like an enemy that had been waiting for you since birth. It seeped into your bones with icy fingers, made your teeth chatter like frightened drums, and whispered doubts into your ear, asking why in the 9 realms you didn't choose a peaceful life raiding monasteries somewhere warm. The North Sea didn't care about Viking courage, or dreams, or destiny. It only cared about crushing them. Its waves rose like towering mistakes, each one threatening to swallow the ship whole. And yet through madness, stubbornness, or a curse from the gods, the Vikings kept sailing straight into that gray mouth of death. Their longships were masterpieces of engineering, fast, sleek, and about as comfortable as being buried alive. No cabins, no shelter, no mercy, just an open deck and a scream of wind so sharp it felt personal. Helmets froze in minutes, beards turned into icy chains, and every spray of seawater stabbed like needles dipped in winter, lighting a fire. Impossible. One spark on a tar-sealed ship, and the whole crew became the world's first Viking barbecue. So they sailed in darkness, in frozen silence, wrapped in wool cloaks that smelled like wet animals and hopelessness. They lined the deck with straw, as if a handful of hay could fight the ocean's fury. It froze by morning crunchy, brittle, like shattered Viking pride. Sleeping was a negotiation with pain. You curled on the planks beside 20 other exhausted men, each reeking of fish, and fear, praying your only dry sock wouldn't be stolen by someone more desperate than you. Waves slapped the hull. The wind howled like a beast hunting for warm flesh. And still, somehow, sleep claimed them not out of comfort, but pure exhaustion. Their bodies shutting down before their minds could fully remember they were freezing to death. But the worst enemy wasn't the cold. It was the quiet. When the sea turned still, glassy, silent, watching you suddenly felt every numb finger, every deadened toe, every fading thread of will. And in that moment, every Viking realized a terrible truth. This was still better than farming turnips. There were no fires on deck, no warm cabins to retreat to, just a ship made of wood, tar, and Viking stubbornness, cutting through a world that wanted them dead. Every man had half a meter of space generous, in the same way a coffin is generous. Straw beneath them froze into a thin layer of regret. Cloaks stiffened into icy shells. Furs turned to boards. Every breath felt stolen. Every heartbeat. Layers, help, tunics, cloaks, stolen pelts, but no matter how many a man wore, the cold always found a crack, slipped through, and settled in like an uninvited ghost. And then there was the splash, a sudden wave to the face for those sleeping at the edge, A boot in the ribs for those in the middle as the morning rowers stomped awake. There was no good spot, only less terrible ones. But there was one thing, one fragile ember of hope that every crew depended on: the sleeping fire. A tiny clay or iron container filled with smoldering coals buried in ash. It didn't burn. It glowed quiet, stubborn, like the last whisper of warmth in a world made of frost and misery. Losing it meant humiliation, starvation, and a night spent wondering if you could survive frozen fish yet again. Men guarded it obsessively, like modern people guard their last sliver of battery. It wasn't just fire, it was proof they were still alive. Storms tossed the ship, waves slammed the hull. Sometimes the brazier tipped, spilling sparks, sending the crew into a frenzy of stomping, shouting, and praying to every god they'd ever heard of. Most survived, which only convinced them Odin protected fools. But still, each night they gathered around that tiny glow, palms out, pretending it was warm. It wasn't, not even close. But in that endless dark, even a faint ember felt like defiance. Each morning, someone was assigned to check the ember box. He was always sweaty. The unlucky soul would crouch over it, blow gently, and hope the coals still breathed. If they didn't, congratulations, you had just become the most hated man on the entire ship. There were no redos, no miracles waiting in the frostbitten dark. You'd have to build fire from nothing but flint, steel, and whatever scrap of will to live still clung to your bones. Doing that with fingers stiff as driftwood on a deck that lurched like a dying beast was about as easy as assembling IKEA furniture during the end of the world. When land finally rose out of the mist, the sleeping fire was dragged out, stirred awake, coaxed, threatened, prayed over, until it breathed again. The crew gathered around it with the reverence of starving men greeting a lost god. They roasted meat with shaking hands, dried clothes that had forgotten warmth, and sat in silence, so heavy it felt like grief. No one admitted they had spent the last week arguing with a fistful of ash and hope. Some sagas called the Ember Keeper sacred, others called it punishment. Both were wrong. It was terror wrapped in responsibility. You weren't carrying heat, you were carrying 30 men's sanity in a clay jar. Drop it, and you'd pray the sea dragged you under before the crew reached you. So no, Vikings didn't have fireplaces. They had a dying ember in a box, and men too cold to ask the gods why. The fire slept, but it dreamed of kinder hands. When it came to clothing, Vikings lived by one law: survival is the only fashion. The North Sea didn't care if you looked heroic. It cared about whether your organs froze before sunrise. Every outfit began with wool-heavy, itch-scratching, water-soaked wool. Tunics, trousers, socks, cloaks, an entire wardrobe built from a damp sheep's nightmare. It trapped heat, absorbed misery, and smelled like the soul of a wet barn. Vikings didn't mind. A little stench kept frostbite and unwanted conversation away. Over that came animal hides: deer, bear, seal, reindeer, thing that once ran faster than a Viking carrying an axe. The hides were stiff, heavy, and unforgiving, but they kept the wind at bay. Furs lined hoods and cloaks, creating what scholars now politely call the Viking sauna aesthetic. The mission was simple: build as many layers as possible between your skin and the apocalypse. Some warriors wore several tunics at once, not for style, but because laundry was a myth told to children. Boots were their own tragedy. leather-bound with cords, stuffed with grass, or mossless footwear, more a desperate suggestion of footwear. They worked until the grass froze, turning each step into a silent scream. Colors were limited: brown, gray, maybe red if you'd robbed someone with taste. Dyes were expensive. No one cared. Fashion dies quickly when your eyebrows freeze together. Jewelry, their rings, brooches, armbands, was their one luxury. If you were going to freeze to death, you might as well look important doing it. Despite the sagas, most Vikings looked less like gods and more like exhausted lumberjacks, wrapped in whatever roadkill was available. Their clothes dripped seawater, sweat, and animal fat, and still somehow weren't the worst smell on the ship. But their layering worked. The wind could cut, the ocean could bite, the gods could laugh, but the Vikings stayed alive. Miserable, frozen, but alive. And in the North Sea, that was a miracle. The body part they feared losing most wasn't fingers, it was feet. Fingers were optional, toes were survival. No one wanted to raid Paris with feet that snapped like dry twigs. Human feet weren't made for standing in frozen puddles while your commander shouted poetry about honor. The ship was always soaked sea spray, melting ice, and the quiet tears of men realizing this was their life now. So they invented Viking socksgrass, dry sedge or moss stuffed into boots like nature's insulation. You pushed your feet in and hoped for 10 minutes of comfort. You rarely got it. The shoes were simple leather wraps that made you feel like you were walking barefoot on ice. Archaeologists found Viking boots that resembled depressed origami experiments. Some smeared animal fat on their feet to repel moisture. It worked. It also made the ship smell like a seal carcass, abandoned by the gods. At camp, the misery continued. You couldn't dry boots by the fire; they'd warp, shrink, or ignite. So you wore them constantly until your toes went numb enough to stop arguing with you. At first glance, the longship was elegant, the icon of Viking power. Then you stepped aboard and realized you were living inside a wooden coffin with dreams of splintering. Comfort was a fantasy, but the ship worked. Its curves, its planks, its tar-sealed seams all existed for one purpose: not sinking. Warmth, optional; survival, mandatory. Builders overlapped planks in clinker construction, sealing cracks with tar and animal fat. It kept water out mostly, but cold. Cold slipped through the wood like a ghost, gripping your spine with icy fingers. Shields hung along the sides served two purposes: defense and blocking wind that threatened to freeze eyelids shut. The ship became a floating shield, while a burrito of misery wrapped in wood. Some crews stuffed moss and straw under their sleeping spots. It helped until it froze solid and fused with the floor. When storms came, the ship groaned, flexed, and threatened mutiny. Men huddled below deck, praying their floating miracle didn't remember it was made entirely of trees. But the longship was still there, blanketa thin, creaking barrier between them and oblivion. Comfort didn't matter. Survival did. If the ship didn't burn, sink, or split in half, it counted as a warm night. Eventually, somewhere between frostbite and despair, Vikings decided they deserved shelter. Not real shelter, just a piece of canvas stretched above their heads so they could pretend the sky wasn't trying to kill them. A ship tenter, about as protective as holding a napkin over a volcano, made from coarse wool or sailcloth. It sagged across the ship, anchored by oars, shields, and pure delusion. It didn't stop the rain. It didn't stop the cold. What it stopped was hope. And sometimes that was enough to keep a crew sane. Under this makeshift tent, 20 to 30 men huddled together, packed tighter than salted fish. When your ship's deck was a frozen plank buffet, and your beard doubled as an icicle collection, singing kept the blood moving and the madness contained. Rhythm gave warmth structure. Out on the North Sea, where the sky was nothing but a vast tombstone, and the waves rose like giant fists ready to crush every dream you ever had, singing was more than a habit, it was a lifeline, a last thread connecting sanity to survival, humanity to hope. No Viking ever started singing because he wanted to. He sang because his body was failing first, because his fingers were turning stiff, because his breath came out like smoke from a dying fire, because his mind began drifting into that dangerous quiet where men hallucinate warmth that isn't there. Songs were the only thing sharp enough to cut through the cold before the cold cut through them. At first, only one voice would rise, a cracked whisper, a tremble so thin it seemed like the wind might shatter it. But then another voice joined, rougher, angrier, fighting the cold with sheer stubbornness. Then another. Soon the entire crew, all half frozen, half mad, fully desperate men, lifted their voices like a defiant army against an enemy that could not be seen, only felt. Each note was a blow against death. Each verse a rebellion against the sea. Each breath a gamble with the frost gnawing at their lungs. They weren't singing for joy, they were singing to stay alive. The deck beneath them was a killing field of ice-lick planks that could send a man sliding into the black water with one careless step. Many had slipped, some had vanished forever. The sea kept its secrets. The Vikings kept singing anyway. Their beards froze into weapons. Their eyebrows stiffened into white, frosted masks of determination. Their teeth chattered so violently that sometimes it blended into the rhythm. But they didn't stop, because the moment the singing ended, the silence arrived. And silence was the true enemy. In silence, fear crept between the men like a shadow. In silence, doubts whispered louder than the storm. In silence, a man remembered how cold he really was, and that was enough to break him. So when their throats burned, they kept singing. When their lips cracked open, they kept singing. When their breath turned thin and painful, they sang louder. They sang old battle chants that tasted like iron and memory. They sang childhood songs taught by mothers they barely remembered. They sang prayers disguised as threats to the gods. They sang curses at the sea itself, challenging the waves to try harder, and slowly, impossibly, warmth flickered in them. Not real warmth, not the kind that comes from fire, but the warmth of defiance, the warmth of refusing to die quietly. Their voices climbed together, twining through the frozen air like ropes, binding the entire crew into one breathing, shivering, determined beast. The shields hanging along the ship's sides vibrated with each thunderous verse, turning the longship itself into an instrument of survival. Even the storm hesitated at times, as if startled by the furious heartbeat of their chant. Every man felt the others beside him, not just their voices, but their existence, their stubbornness, their refusal to bow to the ocean that had swallowed so many before them. The music gave them unity when the cold tried to tear them apart. Some men cried while singing, their tears freezing instantly into tiny pearls of pain. Some closed their swollen, frost-bitten eyes and imagined fires they once sat beside. Some clutched their cloaks tighter, trembling with exhaustion, but forcing their voices to rise again and again. Because in that storm, the song was the only thing louder than fear. It didn't matter if they were out of tune. It didn't matter if their voices cracked. It didn't matter if half of them were singing words from entirely different sagas. What mattered was the rhythm, the heartbeat they shared. It bound them, strengthened them, kept them human. When the waves crashed hard enough to tilt the ship sideways, their song steadied them. When the wind screamed like an angry god, their voices rose even higher. When the night grew long and no one knew if dawn would find them still alive, they clung to the rhythm like it was a shield, and in a way it was. Their music pushed back the madness, held back the terror, carved out a small, fragile bubble of warmth in a universe of ice. And in that bubble, for a moment, they remembered they were warriors, not victims, sailors, not corpses, brothers, not shadows, waiting to slip into the sea. For as long as they kept singing, they lived. For as long as the rhythm held, so did their courage. For as long as their voices rose, they refused to surrender to the cold. Because on a Viking longship, where fire was forbidden and warmth a myth, the only heat left in the world came from their lungs, their hearts, their stubborn spirits, and the songs they forced into existence. When your ship's deck was a frozen plank buffet, and your beard doubled as an icicle collection, singing kept the blood moving and the madness contained. Rhythm gave warmth structure. Harmony gave misery company. A strange sort of comfort, really, the kind that only appears when suffering becomes so familiar it starts feeling like an old friend. On a Viking ship, surrounded by endless black water and winds sharp enough to carve regret into your bones, singing wasn't just noise, it was medicine. The closest thing these men had to therapy, a therapy stripped of couches, blankets, and coping skills, leaving behind nothing but raw voices clawing at the cold. The songs were simple because anything complicated froze before it reached the air. Low chants, rowing rhythms, war hymns that tasted like iron and old blood. They were half melody, half groan, the soundtrack of 20 men pretending their joints weren't crystallizing inside their flesh. Some songs were about glory, others about ale and women, and a few were definitely about how much every single man on that ship currently regretted all his life choices that led him onto this floating slab of misery. The sagas were polite. They never included the sad sea shanties no warrior would admit to, but they existed. They had to. No one rows across the Arctic in silence unless they've already surrendered their soul. These were working songs, survival chants, really timed to the rhythm of the oars, designed to keep the crew from drifting into that deadly quiet where frostbite sneaks in and steals fingers before a man realizes he is dying. And the result? A sound so haunting, so primal, that even the ocean paused at times to listen. Voices cracking, lips freezing, mid-verse, men singing in a key no human ear had ever approved of. A choir of half-frozen lunatics challenging nature with nothing but noise. The music didn't just pass the time, it bound the crew. Men who stole rations from one another, men who fought over blankets and boots, suddenly harmonized like brothers, forged in the same furnace of frost and stubbornness. It drowned the groans of the ship, the hiss of the wind, and that quiet voice whispering, "You could have stayed home." And when storms hit, real storms, the kind that turn the sky into a roaring, living beast, they sang louder. Not because it changed anything, not because the sea cared, but because shouting into chaos made them feel like they mattered, like they still had a say in a world trying very hard to kill them. There was something beautifully stupid about it. Humans, screaming into the storm, insisting they would not go quietly. Some claimed the gods heard those songs. Maybe they did. Maybe they ignored them. Maybe the wind snatched the sound away before it could rise to the heavens. But to the Vikings, that didn't matter. Singing kept frost from reaching their hearts, if not their skin. In a world where warmth was rare and hope was fragile, defiance was the closest thing they had to heat. Nothing defies the cold like a Viking chorus screaming into the void. And for all their boldness, for all their fearlessness, for all the sagas that painted them as warriors without weakness, the Vikings had one very unheroic fear: fire. Not the poetic kind flickering in a shrine. Real fire. The kind that turns a tar-soaked ship into a floating northern funeral pyre. Fire was warmth, yes, but it was treachery. Ice was cruel but predictable. Ice took you slowly. Fire took you screaming. Every longship was basically a list of things you should never set on fire: tar, rope, wool, sails, timber, and dreams soaked in salt water. That's why no Viking in his right mind lit a torch on deck. No bonfires, no cozy flames, no romantic candlelight dinners with a warrior and his goat. Instead, they carried embers, tiny smoldering coals locked inside clay pots and iron boxes. Little sleeping fires, just alive enough to keep hope warm, but not alive enough to burn everything you loved. Lighting a full fire mid-voyage was the kind of brilliant stupidity that got you remembered in the sagas as a warning, not a hero. At home, flames belonged to the hearth, the center of life, guarded by women, blessed by gods. Extinguishing it was like erasing your existence. But at sea, fire had no master. It lived wild, untamed, a god with no leash. And every Viking respected it the way prisoners respect the man holding the keys. They whispered to their ember boxers, like to a sleeping beast, "Stay alive, but not too alive," a strange prayer, but necessary. Ironically, their greatest fear was the same element that carried warriors to Valhalla. Only the dead deserved a shipfire. Only the fallen earned that flaming voyage into legend. To the living, fire was chaos. To the dead, it was release. If the Vikings worshipped anything truly, it wasn't Odin or Thor. It was suffering. Pain wasn't an obstacle. It was a right. Comfort was suspicious. Warmth was a trap. Softness was weakness. Weakness made you French. From childhood, they were taught that hardship builds the kind of character that can walk into a storm and smile at the lightning. Their sagas romanticized this. He sailed through snow, they said, berarmed and laughing. They always forgot to mention that his arms were so numb he couldn't feel anything, and the laughter was hysterical. Pain was proof of strength. Cold was proof of life. A Viking wasn't truly alive until something was trying to kill him. Their gods lived that truth. Odin pierced himself on a tree for wisdom. Tyr lost a hand to a wolf. Baldur died because someone threw a stick at him. Suffering wasn't punishment, it was divine. Comfort wasn't blessed, endurance was. So they embraced the cold, like monks embrace silence, with grim enthusiasm and zero alternatives. They turned every frost-bitten voyage into a sermon, every storm into a holy ritual. They howled back at the wind. They laughed at the waves. They shrugged at the gods when ignored. Suffering didn't mean abandonment. It meant attention. While modern people chase comfort, heated floors, soft sheets, 20 flavors of tea, a Viking would have called all of that demonic sorcery, Happiness wasn't measured in luxury. It was measured in how long you could row without crying. And in a twisted way, maybe they were right. They didn't pray for safety. They prayed for resilience. They didn't ask for mercy. They asked for strength. They didn't survive the cold. They became it. And so, after all the ice, hunger, storms, and terrible life decisions, how did Vikings stay warm without fire? The short answer, they didn't. The long answer, they cheated death through arrogance and stubbornness. Warmth wasn't something they had. It was something they became. They turned suffering into strength, pain into fuel, misery into momentum. Their hearts became furnaces burning with pride and fury. Their breath became smoke. Their voices became fire. They wrapped themselves in furs, cloaks, wet wool, and denial, then called it resilience. They huddled under canvas and sang into storms, as if sound alone could keep death at bay. Maybe it could. Maybe that's why they lived, when softer men stayed home writing poetry about beaches. They didn't need comfort. They needed purpose. Every frozen wave, every screaming wind, every night that threatened to end them reminded them who they were. People too stubborn to die. To freeze quietly was cowardice. To keep rowing was heroism. To return home was a miracle. And when they finally stepped onto land, blistered, starving, half alive, they didn't curse the cold. They thanked it, because the sea had tested them and they survived. Not because the gods saved them, but because no one else was worthy of enduring what they endured. Their warmth was never on the outside. It was in their spirit, a wildfire trapped in ice. And that's how the Vikings conquered the cold, not by escaping it, but by becoming colder than the cold itself.